Every single day, we make hundreds of small, seemingly insignificant decisions. We choose what to eat for breakfast, what road to take on our commute, what book to read before bed, or whether to strike up a casual conversation with a stranger on the bus. Most of the time, these little choices fade into the background of our lives, completely forgotten by the time we wake up the next morning. But every once in a while, one of those tiny, routine decisions sets off a massive, unstoppable chain reaction. A single choice, made in a split second of boredom, desperation, or simple curiosity, can completely reshape a person's life forever. And sometimes it does not just change their own life, it changes the lives of millions and millions of other people all around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 normal, everyday people who found themselves standing at these exact crossroads. They made choices that felt completely ordinary at the time, but those decisions ended up sending shockwaves through history, pop culture, and global politics. Our first story begins on a cold, gray afternoon in the year 2009 inside a quiet, dimly lit manga cafe in the bustling city of Seoul, South Korea. A 38-year-old man named Hwang Dong-huk was sitting in a small, private wooden booth staring blankly at the wall. A manga cafe is a very popular place in South Korea where people can go to escape the noise and stress of the city. You can buy cheap snacks, sip on hot drinks, and browse through massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with thousands of manga volumes, which are essentially Japanese comic books. It is a place designed for quiet comfort and cheap relaxation, but on this particular day, Hwang Dong-hyuk was anything but relaxed. The truth was, he was completely broke. He did not have enough money to buy a cup of coffee or a small snack from the cafe counter. He had only come inside because it was a warm, quiet place to sit and escape the harsh, unforgiving reality of his daily life. At 38 years old, his life was in complete shambles. For his entire adult life, he had dreamed of becoming a successful writer and film director. He had spent years studying the craft, working long hours on various movie sets, and trying to get his scripts noticed by major production companies. He had successfully landed a few small temporary jobs here and there, writing a script or directing a minor project, but the entertainment industry in Seoul was incredibly competitive and unpredictable. Every single time he thought he was finally making progress, the project would suddenly fizzle out, the funding would dry up, and he would find himself right back where he started, completely unemployed. At this point in his life, he was completely out of options and drowning in debt. He lived in a tiny, cramped apartment with his elderly mother and his grandmother. Even though all 3 of them pooled every single penny they had, they still struggled to pay their monthly rent and keep the heating on. The financial stress was absolutely crushing, hanging over him like a dark cloud. Just a few weeks prior, Hwang had been forced to make a heart-wrenching decision. He had to sell his laptop, which was his most prized possession, and the only tool he had to write his scripts. He sold it for a fraction of what it was worth, just so his family would not get evicted onto the cold streets. To make matters worse, he had started taking out short-term, high-interest loans just to buy basic necessities like white rice and medicine. He had absolutely no way of paying them back, and the debt was piling up like a mountain, with predatory debt collectors constantly calling his phone. The anxiety was so intense that he could barely sleep. The only way he could find even a temporary moment of peace was to escape into the world of manga. So, on this afternoon, he went to the cafe's library shelves, searched through the volumes, and pulled down a copy of his absolute favorite manga series. It was a highly controversial and incredibly violent survival story called Battle Royale. The story follows a class of high school students who are forced by a ruthless authoritarian government to fight each other to the death on a deserted island until only one survivor remains. The manga was notorious for its graphic violence and dark psychological themes, but to Hwang it was a masterpiece. It was so over-the-top and dramatic that it allowed him to completely forget about his own miserable life, if only for an hour. As he sat in his booth, turning the pages and reading the story for the 20th time, a sudden thought struck him. He looked at the pages, showing characters fighting for survival, and then he thought about his own desperate situation. He thought about the crushing weight of his debt, the feeling of absolute hopelessness, and the sheer desperation that consumed him every single day. He realized that there were millions of people in South Korea and all over the world who were experiencing this exact same kind of financial desperation. And then he had a massive epiphany. What if he wrote a story that combined the extreme high-stakes survival elements of Battle Royale with the harsh modern reality of extreme poverty? He started thinking about his childhood, playing innocent street games like the Squid Game, Red Light, Green Light, and the Dalgona Candy Challenge with his friends. Back then, the only stakes were who got to be the king of the playground. But what if, instead of high school students forced to fight by a government, the story was about ordinary, deeply indebted adults who willingly signed up to play these innocent childhood games for a massive cash prize? They would know that losing meant death, but their real lives were already such a living hell that they were willing to take the risk. The idea was so brilliant and so raw that it made his hands shake. He did not have his laptop anymore, but he had a cheap pen and some scraps of paper. He leaned over the table in his booth and began to write furiously. He sketched out characters, came up with ideas for different games, and outlined a complex, dark narrative about human nature and greed. He wrote for hours and hours, completely losing track of time. By the time the cafe manager tapped on his shoulder to tell him they were closing, Hwang had a complete, detailed outline of a brand new world. Over the next several months, Hwang worked tirelessly to turn this outline into a full, polished script. He had to write much of it by hand on yellow legal pads, but he poured his entire soul into it. He was absolutely convinced that this script was his masterpiece, the one project that would finally pull his family out of poverty. But when he finally finished the script and began pitching it to investors and production studios, his dreams were completely shattered. Every single buyer he met with rejected it immediately. They told him the script was way too weird, far too dark, and completely unrealistic. They said that a story about desperate people murdering each other in children's games was too grotesque for television and that no mainstream audience would ever want to watch it. For 10 long years, Hwang Dong-hook carried that script with him everywhere he went. He remained broke, his family continued to struggle, and he was forced to take on low-paying menial jobs just to survive. He often had to skip meals, and the shame of being unable to support his mother and grandmother ate away at him. But despite all the rejections and the constant self-doubt, he refused to throw the script away. He knew in his gut that the story was powerful, and that people who had experienced real struggle would relate to the themes of desperation and survival. Then, fast forward to the year 2019. Out of nowhere, a major global production studio decided to take a massive gamble. They looked at Hwang's script and saw something unique. They bought the rights to the story and put it into production as a high-budget television series. 12 years after Hwang Dong-hyuk had sat in that manga cafe, broke and hopeless, his vision was finally brought to life. In September of 2021, the show premiered. Almost overnight, the series became a monumental global phenomenon. It completely dominated the internet, becoming the most-watched show in the history of the streaming platform. It sparked thousands of memes, merchandise lines, and discussions about economic inequality in modern society. The show ultimately generated over $900 million in value for the production company. And as for Hwang Dong-hook, his life was changed forever. He was finally able to pay off all his debts, buy a beautiful home for his mother and grandmother, and secure his place as one of the most respected writers and directors in the industry, even winning a prestigious Emmy Award for his direction. The manga series that started it all was Battle Royale, and the global phenomenon that Hwang created was called Squid Game. It all happened because a desperate man with no money in his pocket made the simple decision to walk into a cafe and read his favorite comic book. It is truly amazing how a single afternoon in a manga cafe could lead to one of the biggest television shows in human history. But now, let us travel back to a different time and place, to the hot summer of 1953 in the city of Memphis, Tennessee. Inside a small, unassuming brick building on Union Avenue, a 30-year-old man named Sam Phillips was busy cleaning up his recording studio. The studio was called Sun Records, and it was Sam's pride and joy. Memphis was a city bursting with musical energy, a place where gospel, blues, country, and rhythm and blues were constantly blending together on the street corners and in the local clubs. Sam was a deeply passionate music lover who believed that the big, established record labels in New York and Los Angeles were completely out of touch with the raw, authentic music of the American South. He wanted to capture that raw energy, but he did not have the money or the connections to sign big-name acts. So, Sam came up with a very unique and highly unusual business model. He decided to open up his recording studio to absolutely anyone who walked off the street. He set up a policy where anyone could walk into Sun Records at any time, hand him exactly $4, and in exchange, Sam would record them professionally and press their song onto a double-sided acetate disc. Sam hoped that by casting such a wide net, he would eventually find a rare, undiscovered talent, a star that could put his studio on the map. But the reality of this business model was incredibly grueling. Most of the people who paid the $4 were not talented at all. They were amateur singers who sang completely out of key, played their instruments poorly, and left Sam sitting in the control room with a massive headache. On this particular summer afternoon, Sam had just finished recording a local church choir, which had gone reasonably well, and now he was sweeping up the dust, wrapping up heavy microphone cables, and resetting his recording equipment, hoping that someone interesting would walk through the door. And then, the door opened, and an 18-year-old kid walked inside. The kid was dressed in simple work clothes, covered in grease and sweat from his day job, and he had a cheap acoustic guitar slung over his shoulder. Sam had never seen him before, and right away he could tell the kid was incredibly shy. He stood near the entrance, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, barely making eye contact with Sam. The young man walked up to the reception desk and met Sam's assistant, a woman named Marion Keisker. She asked him what kind of singer he was, and the kid replied that he sang all kinds. When she asked who he sounded like, he famously looked down and said that he did not sound like nobody. Sam greeted him warmly and asked how he could help him. The young man cleared his throat and explained in a very soft, polite voice that he worked as a truck driver for a local electrical supply company called Crown Electric. He said that he loved to play the guitar and sing in his spare time, and that he wanted to use the $4 service to record a couple of traditional, slow ballads as a birthday gift for his beloved mother, Gladys. Sam, always welcoming, smiled and told him to step right into the recording booth. The kid handed over his $4, walked into the small booth, and positioned himself in front of the microphone. Sam went back into the control room, put on his headphones, and prepared himself for what he assumed would be a very average, mediocre performance. But the moment the kid struck the first chord on his guitar and began to sing, Sam's jaw practically hit the floor. The transformation was absolute. The incredibly shy, awkward teenager who had just been mumbling at the front door completely vanished. In his place was an artist of unbelievable depth and power. His voice was incredibly rich, warm, and filled with a deep, soulful emotion that seemed far beyond his 18 years. He sang the slow ballads with perfect control and a hauntingly beautiful tone that filled the entire studio. Sam sat in the control room, completely paralyzed, listening to this truck driver sing. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was listening to someone truly extraordinary. When the recording was finished, the young man stopped singing, and just like that, the magic vanished. He instantly reverted back to being a shy, polite teenager. He stepped out of the booth, thanked Sam quietly, took his newly pressed acetate disc, and walked out into the hot Memphis sun. Once the kid was gone, Sam sat in the silence of his studio, his heart racing. He reached for his notepad where he kept track of the people who came into the studio, and he wrote down a quick, urgent note to himself. It read, "Good ballad singer. Save." He knew he had to keep this kid in mind for the future. Fast forward to the summer of 1954, about a year after that fateful afternoon. Sam was back in the studio, working with a local country music band. They were trying to record a few tracks, but the session was going terribly. The band was talented, but they felt like their instrumental tracks were flat and lacked a strong, defining lead voice to pull everything together. They asked Sam if he knew of any vocalists in the area who might be able to help them. Sam's studio manager, who had been present during the young truck driver session the year before, immediately jumped in. She reminded Sam of the shy 18-year-old who had recorded the ballads for his mother, insisting that his voice was one of the best she had ever heard. Sam agreed and decided to give the young man a call. The kid was thrilled to get the invitation and rushed down to the studio to meet the band. But when they began to play, the session was a complete disaster. The young man was still a fantastic singer, but he and the band had absolutely no chemistry. They had just met, and they were trying to play standard, highly structured country and pop songs. The kid's slow, expressive ballad style did not fit the up-tempo, rigid rhythm of the band at all. It sounded stiff, awkward, and completely lifeless. Sam watched from the control room, feeling the tension rise. After several failed attempts, he could see that everyone was getting frustrated and tired. He decided to call for a quick break to let everyone clear their heads. The band members and the young singer put down their instruments and walked out of the live room to grab a cold drink and step outside. Sam walked into the adjacent control room to sit in silence and try to figure out how to salvage the session. The control room did not have a window looking into the live booth, so he was completely cut off from seeing what was happening in there. But then, through the heavy walls of the studio, Sam heard a faint sound. It turns out that the young singer had gone back into the recording booth alone while the band was still outside. He had picked up his acoustic guitar and started playing an old blues song called That's All Right, which had originally been recorded by an artist named Arthur Crudup. But the kid was not playing it like a traditional blues song. He was playing it incredibly fast, with a driving, bouncing, energetic rhythm that was completely unique. He was tapping on the wood of his guitar, creating a beat that made it impossible not to move. Hearing the upbeat noise, the band members ran back into the booth, grabbed their instruments, and began to play along with him, caught up in the pure, unadulterated joy of the sound. Sam stood up in the control room, his ears ringing with this incredible, loud, kinetic music. He ran out of the control room, threw open the door to the recording booth, and what he saw absolutely took his breath away. The shy, quiet truck driver was leaping around the room, totally lost in the rhythm, strumming his guitar with a wild, infectious energy. His voice was pouring out of him with a raw, electric power, a perfect blend of soulful blues and energetic country swing. It was a sound that Sam had never heard in his entire life, a completely new kind of music that defied any existing genre. Sam stood there with goosebumps covering his arms, realizing that this was the exact sound he had been searching for his entire life. He shouted to the band to keep playing exactly what they were playing, quickly turned on the recording equipment, and captured the track on tape that very night. When the song was played on a local Memphis radio station a few days later, the station was completely flooded with phone calls from listeners demanding to hear it again. The young truck driver became a sensation overnight, launching a career that would completely revolutionize the music industry and pop culture forever. The studio was Sun Records, and the young truck driver who spent $4 to record a song for his mother was none other than Elvis Presley, the future king of rock and roll. It is truly mind-blowing to think that the entire history of rock and roll was set in motion because a young man wanted to make a thoughtful birthday gift for his mother. But our third story takes us to a very different kind of arena, where a single, high-stakes decision in a boxing ring completely transformed a man's reputation and paved his way to leading an entire nation. Our story takes place on the evening of March 31st, 2012, in the city of Ottawa, Canada. Inside a massive, brightly lit convention center, a 40-year-old man named Justin was standing in the corner of a professional boxing ring. The arena was packed to the brim with hundreds of screaming spectators, and television cameras were swooping overhead, broadcasting the event to thousands of viewers across the country. Justin was incredibly nervous. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, and his hands were sweating inside his heavy boxing gloves. This was easily the most important athletic event of his life, but it was also, terrifyingly, the very first time he had ever stepped into a boxing ring for an actual fight. He was a complete amateur, and he knew that his entire reputation and future were on the line. The match was a highly publicized charity event called the Fight for the Cure, designed to raise funds for cancer research. But there was also a massive political rivalry at play. Justin was a young, ambitious member of parliament, and his opponent was a conservative senator. The fight was viewed by the media as a symbolic battle between two opposing political ideologies and personalities. It was a clash between the progressive, young liberal and the older, traditional conservative. Justin looked across the ring and locked eyes with his opponent. His opponent's name was Brass Knuckles Brazil, although his real name was Patrick Brazeau. He was a highly intimidating figure who had served in the Canadian military and held a black belt in karate. He was notorious for possessing an incredibly strong, bone-shattering punch, which is how he had earned the nickname Brass Knuckles Brazil. He was several pounds heavier than Justin, with broad shoulders and a reputation for raw physical aggression. During the pre-fight weigh-in, the contrast between the two men could not have been more obvious. Brass Knuckles Brazil stood there shirtless, showing off his muscular, tattooed physique, looking like a professional gladiator. Justin, on the other hand, looked lean and relatively average, leading the media and the public to completely write him off before the match even started. Almost everyone who was following the fight believed that Brass Knuckles Brazil was going to absolutely destroy Justin. And it was not just because of his opponent's military background and martial arts skills, but because of Justin's own public reputation. To the Canadian public, Justin was viewed as a soft, pampered, and incredibly privileged intellectual. He was the son of a highly famous former prime minister, and most people believed he had lived a life of luxury, completely insulated from any real physical hardship or conflict. He was seen as a lightweight, a handsome and charming man who lacked any real toughness or grit, often dismissed as a mere drama teacher who had stumbled into politics. The idea of him entering a boxing ring against a military veteran was seen as a joke. When Justin had first entered the ring that night, the sports announcers on television did not even try to hide their skepticism. They openly mocked his appearance, his fancy hair, and his bright red boxing trunks. They immediately gave him the mocking nickname of the Shiny Pony, laughing about how quickly he was going to get knocked out by a tough military veteran like Brass Knuckles Brazil. They predicted that the fight would not even last past the first round. But what the announcers and the public did not know was that the Shiny Pony had been training quietly and intensely for months. He had spent hours in local gyms, sweating, lifting weights, and practicing his punches, determined to prove to the world that he was much tougher than his pampered image suggested. He had learned how to take a punch, how to move his feet, and how to maintain his breathing under intense pressure. The bell rang for the first round, and the fight began. Justin, fueled by pure adrenaline, charged across the ring and immediately started throwing wild, heavy punches. But his technique was chaotic, and Brass Knuckles Brazil easily slipped and ducked away from every single blow. And then the counterattack came. Brass Knuckles Brazil stepped forward and began to pummel Justin with brutal, precise force. He landed heavy, painful punches to Justin's ribs, chest, and face. Justin's head snapped back under the impact of the blows, and he quickly found himself completely overwhelmed, bleeding from his nose and mouth, and desperately clinging to his opponent just to stay upright. The heavy gloves of the military veteran felt like blocks of cement hitting his jaw. The announcers on television were practically laughing, calling the match a complete slaughter and mocking Justin for ever thinking he could step into a ring with a real fighter. They commented that the Shiny Pony was about to be sent to the pasture. Justin was in absolute agony, his vision spinning, and he was on the absolute verge of falling to the canvas. His body wanted to give up, and his brain was telling him to lie down and let the pain stop. But right before Brass Knuckles Brazil could land a decisive knockout punch, the bell rang, signaling the end of the first round. Justin stumbled back to his corner, his legs shaking. The ringside medic immediately rushed in to clean the blood off his face, and his coach leaned in, shouting instructions and trying to get him to focus. But Justin could barely hear a word. His head was throbbing, and he was in deep physical shock. But amid all the pain and the roaring of the crowd, a clear, powerful realization came over him. He knew that if he quit now, or if he allowed himself to get easily knocked out in the second round, his public life would be completely over. He would permanently be branded as a joke, a weak, pampered coward who tried to act tough on national television and got humiliated. He knew that the only way to save his reputation was to fight with absolute, reckless abandon. He had to stop trying to box defensively and simply fight for his life. The bell rang for the second round. Justin stood up, wiped the blood from his eyes, and charged back out into the center of the ring. But this time, his energy was completely different. He was fast, relentless, and completely focused. He went straight at Brass Knuckles Brazil, throwing a rapid barrage of heavy punches. And to the absolute shock of everyone in the arena, his punches began to land. He struck Brass Knuckles Brazil with a series of powerful, stinging blows to the head and body. The military veteran was caught completely off guard, expecting Justin to be timid and defeated after the beating he had taken in the first round. Instead, he was facing a man who seemed completely possessed and utterly unafraid of pain. Justin kept moving forward, landing hit after hit, driving his opponent back against the ropes. He used his height advantage to keep the veteran at a distance, landing jab after jab with incredible accuracy. The crowd in the convention center erupted into a deafening roar. The sports announcers were in complete disbelief, shouting into their microphones as the shiny pony completely dominated the round. By the time the bell rang to end the second round, it was Brass Knuckles Brazil who was stumbling back to his corner, gasping for air and looking completely stunned. During the brief rest period, Justin stood in his corner, his chest heaving. He looked across the ring and saw that his opponent was avoiding his gaze, looking exhausted, defeated, and deeply shaken. Justin knew that he had won the mental battle. The bell rang for the third and final round. Justin did not hesitate for a second. He charged across the canvas and unleashed a brutal, unstoppable attack on Brass Knuckles Brazil, landing powerful punches to his face over and over again. Finally, Justin landed a massive, bone-crushing right hook directly to his opponent's nose. The impact was so severe that the man's nose completely shattered and blood began to pour down his face. The referee immediately stepped in, pushed Justin back, and stopped the fight. It was a technical knockout victory. The shiny pony had won the match. The arena went absolutely wild, and the victory became the single biggest news story in Canada the next day. While the fight was officially just a charity event to raise money, the true significance of the match was deeply political. Justin had taken a massive, incredibly risky gamble to completely redefine how the entire nation viewed him. By stepping into the ring against a highly formidable opponent, taking a brutal beating, and fighting his way to a dominant victory through sheer grit and determination, he completely shattered his image as a soft, pampered intellectual. The public now saw him as a tough, resilient, and charismatic fighter who was capable of standing his ground and overcoming impossible odds. They realized that he had played a brilliant strategic game, intentionally letting his opponent wear himself out in the first round before launching his own offensive. Justin used this incredible surge of national popularity and respect to launch a massive political campaign, eventually leading his party to a historic victory and getting elected as the Prime Minister of Canada. His full name is Justin Trudeau, and his opponent in that legendary match was Patrick Brazeau, referred to during the broadcast as Brass Knuckles Brazil. It all started because a man, nicknamed the Shiny Pony, decided to step into a boxing ring to prove to his country that he was a fighter. These three stories, as different as they are, all share a powerful and inspiring truth. They show us that our lives are not completely defined by our current circumstances, no matter how difficult, painful, or hopeless they might seem. A broke writer sitting in a quiet cafe with debt collectors calling his phone, a young truck driver who was far too shy to make eye contact with a stranger, and a politician openly mocked by his entire country as a pampered, weak, lightweight. None of them could have predicted where their simple choices would lead them on that day. but by choosing to take a chance, to step out of their comfort zones, and to push forward through the rejection, the physical pain, and the overwhelming doubt, they completely rewrote their destinies. Their decisions did not just change their own lives, they created iconic art, revolutionary music, and political history that will endure for generations to come. It is a powerful reminder that the smallest, most routine choices we make today might just be the very first step on a massive journey that changes everything. We should never underestimate the power of a single moment or a single decision to transform our world forever. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. During the most challenging time of World War II, which was the 1940s, a group of Russian scientists were tasked with the responsibility of tackling a particular problem that was very pressing. The objective was to design a plan that would enable them to maintain the alertness of their men and keep them engaged in warfare for lengthy periods of time. When it came to the demands of the war, fatigue was just as deadly of a foe as any other enemy that might be found on the battlefield of the conflict. Accordingly, they devised a plan for conducting an experiment. A study that was carried out on human subjects with the intention of determining the absolute maximum amount of sleep deprivation that may be tolerated. The objective of this experiment was to ascertain what would occur to the human mind and body in the event that sleep was completely removed from the equation. They required subjects to work with in order to accomplish this. They were able to find the 5 individuals when they were disguised as prisoners of war throughout their search. In light of the fact that these people were likely to face a challenging future, the arrangement that the scientists offered them seemed like a miracle to them. They were informed that they would be subjected to an experimental gas that would prevent them from sleeping for a period of 30 days during the period immediately after the exposure. In the event that they were able to survive the entire 30 days, they would be released from their confinement under the terms of their freedom. As a result of the fact that they had everything to gain, men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain were unable to refuse this offer because they had everything to gain. There is a good chance that when they gave their agreement, they were anticipating a difficult but ultimately manageable struggle that would conclude in them being released as free men. The investigation was carried out inside of a gas chamber that was completely sealed off from the outside world. It had the ability to provide for itself despite the fact that it was quite small. In the interior, there were cots for the 5 guys, a basic bathroom, flowing water, and enough dry food to sustain them for well over a month. Additionally, there was a simple restroom. To further assist in passing the time, there were also literature available for consideration. Absolutely, without a shadow of a question, the gas was the most essential component. A chemical concoction that the researchers believed would effectively inhibit the need for sleep without generating any bad effects that could be fatal was the stimulant that was being tested in this experiment. The researchers believed that this mixture would be effective. Given the circumstances, it was reasonable for them to think that it would not lead to the deaths of the individuals. In those days, there were limitations placed on the usage of technology. The room was not monitored by any closed-circuit cameras at any point during the day or night. Instead, there were no cameras present. As an alternative, the researchers were compelled to rely on a number of microphones that were strategically placed throughout the room in order to listen in on the participants. They had a single, small, round porthole window that was approximately 5 inches thick. This was done for the purpose of delivering a visual. Utilizing this glass, they were able to observe the chamber from the observation room that they were in. They would be able to see the events that took place through this microscopic window and the crackling microphones during the course of the 17 days that followed. Consequently, the staff members brought the 5 men inside the room where they were being held. After they had left, the heavy steel door was secured tightly behind them, and the locks produced a satisfying clanking sound as they were locked. Immediately after that, the researchers began to introduce the stimulant gas into the room through a pump. The experiment had not yet begun, but it was now officially confirmed. At first glance, it seemed as though everything was going according to plan throughout the first few days of the process. The behavior of the individuals was similar with what one would anticipate from any group of strangers who were all confined in the same location. This was the case despite the fact that the participants were awake. During the process of getting to know one another and sharing stories from their prior lives, they participated in idle discussion with one another. There was a sense of cautious optimism that could be heard in their words, as they were of the same opinion that they would be able to make it through this together and obtain the freedom that had been promised to them. Not only did the researchers observe, but they also listened and took notes on what they came across. A gas that was operational was present. In the study, every single person was awake. Things are going swimmingly up to this point. The researchers, on the other hand, began to see a discernible change in the way that the conversations were being carried out on the fourth day of the study. After some time had passed, the idle chatter and incessant chit-chat were no longer present. Instead of talking about anything else, the men started talking almost exclusively about incredibly traumatic events that had occurred in their previous lives. The persons who were listening on the other side of the glass were left feeling uneasy as a result of the fact that they brought up the most challenging periods in their lives and spoke about them in a manner that was not emotional and was monotonous. In spite of the fact that it had only been a few days since the room had been filled with optimism, that optimism had completely disappeared. In consequence of this, it was replaced by a growing sense of unhappiness and pessimism regarding the circumstances in which they currently found themselves. As more time passed, she gradually came to the idea that she was unable to sleep and that she was confined to a room because she was stuck there. In the vicinity of the sixth day, there was yet another occurrence that was of immense consequence. All of the subjects stopped speaking with one another, including each and every one of them. Immediately after that, there was a profound and nervous stillness that pervaded the entire room. A group of males who had previously been a loosely organized group had now fully isolated themselves from one another. This was a significant change from the previous situation. One by one, each and every one of them staked their claim to a certain sector of the room, a small space that was only theirs to hold. They were muttering to themselves in a low voice as they were sitting or standing for long periods of time. The researchers paid close attention to the conversations that were being picked up by the microphones in an effort to make sense of the hushed chats that were being picked up. Through a growing sensation of anxiety, they came to the idea that the subjects had been persuaded that they could achieve their freedom by betraying their fellow troops. This realization caused them to feel uneasy. Subjects would approach one of the mics one at a time and begin whispering once they were in close proximity to it. This would happen in a sequential manner. In order to gain favor with the researchers, who they believed were evaluating them, but who were not there, they would concoct elaborate and false tales about the other participants, accusing them of committing a range of wrongdoing. This was done in an effort to win favor with the researchers. They were under the notion that if they were able to just sell out some of the other option choices, then they would be the ones chosen for distribution. In contrast, the researchers did not take any action in response to the situation. Through simple listening and observation, they meticulously documented the psychological degeneration that was taking place. They were not there to make deals, rather, they were there to observe the ramifications of the gas and the lack of sleep. This was done so that they could see the effects of both of these factors. Over the course of 3 more days, this pattern of secrecy and subtle treachery continued to be observed. With the passage of time, the atmosphere inside the chamber got increasingly suffocating and toxic. The strain was clearly beginning to take its toll on their minds, despite the fact that their bodies were still in good shape. It was obvious that their minds were beginning to break down. After then, the experiment took a violent and terrifying turn on the morning of the 10th day, which ultimately led to the conclusion of the experiment. Surprisingly, and without any prior warning, one of the individuals began screaming. There was no prior warning. It was not a brief outpouring of agony or exasperation by any stretch of the imagination. At the same time, it was a shout of pure misery that was full-throated, continuous, and of a primeval character. As he started screaming at the top of his lungs, he started running back and forth across the small chamber. He was becoming increasingly agitated. There was a reverberation of his voice off of the concrete walls. While observing the scene from the viewport, the researchers stared in a state of stunned scrutiny. 3 hours in a row, the guy fled and yelled in an attempt to get away from the situation. When confronted with this outburst, the other 4 players responded in a manner that was both peculiar and unnerving. There was not a single response from any of them. The man who was yelling did not appear to be real, at least not from the outside. The fact that they did not acknowledge him, that they did not communicate with him, and that they did not make any effort to calm him down was disappointing. They gave off the impression that they were completely oblivious to the fact that they were in a confined space that was rather small and contained a man who was ranting at an extremely high volume. Instead, they made the decision to embark on a peculiar and methodical project that they carried out on their own. Within the books that had been left for them, they started ripping pages out of the volumes as soon as they were placed. The pages were transported to the little bathroom area where they were soaked in water, and then they started plastering them on the interior of the porthole window, which had a thickness of 5 inches. They steadily obscured the researchers' only view into the chamber by covering it with damp papers page after page. This was the only way they could see inside. In spite of the fact that the shrieking continued to fill the room, they worked in a manner that was composed and focused on their goals. After a period of 3 hours, there was an abrupt halt to the screeching that had been going on. Even after the sounds had ceased, the man continued to run in the opposite direction, going back and forth between the 2 locations. There were just a few faint squeaking noises that the researchers were able to pick up on when they listened via the microphones, despite the fact that they made every effort to do so. Their inquiry led them to the conclusion that the man had yelled so loudly and with such ferocity that he had physically torn his own voice cords to shreds. This was the conclusion that they reached after conducting additional investigations. He could only produce those wretched, gasping squeaks, which were the only sounds he could make. After a while, he lost the ability to yell. When his voice eventually gave up, a few of the other subjects had already finished their job. He was the last one to finish. This was the predicament, which involved completely concealing the viewport. Inside the chamber, none of the researchers were able to see what was going on because they were denied access. There was a surprising occurrence that filled the observation box with a new sound, which was silence. Every single one of the yelling had ceased. All of a sudden, there was no longer any whisper at all. It was no longer possible to hear any murmuring. It was completely devoid of everything. Over the course of the succeeding 3 days, the chamber was characterized by an absence of any and all noise whatsoever. After this moment, the researchers were separated from the rest of the population. Not only were they unable to see, but they also lacked the ability to hear something. Their ignorance of the events that were taking place inside was full and utter. As time went on, the scientific team began to experience an increasing sense of terror. Have all of the subjects been left out of the evaluation? Are you of the opinion that there was a problem with the microphones on the stage? The only piece of information they had to work with was a single piece. During the time that they were inside the chamber, they were monitoring the amount of oxygen that was being used up. Furthermore, they were able to deduce on the basis of the data that the gas was still being used at a rate that was comparable to that of 5 individuals who were still alive and breathing at the time. In point of fact, the amounts of oxygen that were consumed were very large, which implies that the subjects were indulging in strenuous physical exercise. Given that they are entirely silent, what might they possibly be doing at this moment? The debate was intense among the group of researchers who were working together. Having endured this unsettling silence for 3 days, I finally reached my breaking point. The decision was reached by them that they needed to take some kind of action. Due to the fact that they were unable to accept the risk of opening the chamber without having any previous information of what was going to take place, they made the decision to make use of the intercom system for the very first time since the experiment had begun. As he came in closer to the microphone, one of the key researchers said something with a strained tone in his voice. He went on to announce to the people in the room that they were going to open the door in order to test the mics. He then proceed with the announcement. In order to ensure that the persons did not struggle, it was requested that they lie down on the floor in a flat position. He gave them the assurance that they would be rewarded to the extent that they complied. After that, he made an offer that he believed would have the effect of breaking the silence and generating a response from the other party. It was his response that he said, "If you comply, one of you will be granted your immediate freedom." In the moments that followed the proclamation, there was a brief pause that was characterized by static. In the time that they were waiting, the researchers did not let their breath escape. Following that, a voice could be heard emanating from the person who was speaking. Even though there were no clouds in the sky, the atmosphere was utterly terrifying. At first glance, it seemed as though a single person had approached a microphone and articulated their thoughts in a manner that was completely understandable. In his statement, he made the statement that we no longer want to be freed. The researchers were filled with fear and confusion as they confronted one another and looked at each other. During that time period, they were still alive. The microphones were operating as expected. The message, on the other hand, was incomprehensible without exception. What might possibly be the reason that they would no longer want to be let free? I was curious as to what exactly had occurred in that room. The decision was made in the end that the chamber would not be open to the public. The chilly response had caused everything to be different from what it had been before. Ultimately, they came to the conclusion that the experiment should be allowed to continue until it produced the desired outcome. It took 2 more days before the silence returned, and when it did, it was profound and unnerving. There was still a cover that was placed over the porthole. The amount of oxygen that was consumed stayed at a somewhat high level. Finally, at the stroke of midnight on the 16th day, the researchers made the announcement that the experiment had been completed in its entirety. Eliminating the stimulant gas from the chamber was the initial step that needed to be taken in order to complete the task. They began an air pump that brought in clean, fresh air after they had turned off the supply of air. Immediately after the chamber was filled with the fresh air, there was a sudden breach in the silence that happened in the room. It was possible to hear a scream coming from within the limits of the room. For this particular occasion, however, there was more than one subject to talk about. To my ears, it seemed as though there were all of them. This is in addition to the fact that they were not yelling out of wrath or despair. As they got closer, they heard screams of terror and desperation coming from them. The researchers were able to hear them pleading and asking for the gas to be turned back on through the communication link that was provided by the intercom. Someone who sounded like they were totally confident that they were soon to pass away was the one who made the statement. A number of soldiers was called in to break into the chamber and remove the individuals who were being held captive, despite the fact that they begged for their release. When they broke the seal that had been placed on the enormous door, the military was able to open it. Although it had been 5 days since the researchers had last seen the scene inside, they were finally able to catch a glimpse of it as they stood behind them. The situation was an example of something that may have been taken straight from a nightmare. The place was a shambles, a piece of disaster. The floor was covered with a thick coating of bloody water that was approximately 4 inches deep and had grown stagnant. This water had gotten stationary. It was the drain in the middle of the room that had been purposely stopped, and it was the source of the issue that was plaguing the establishment. Regrettably, the fifth subject, the one who had ended up not surviving, had passed away. The appearance of his chest and thighs was such that it seemed as though portions of skin had been removed from them. It was determined by the researchers that these pieces of his own body had been used to plug the drain, which led to the room becoming flooded. This was the cause of the flooding. The 4 participants who had survived were in a terrible condition, despite the fact that they were still alive while the experiment was being conducted. The bones on their bodies were visible through the skin, indicating that they were suffering from severe forms of malnutrition. The most unsettling element of the situation, on the other hand, was the fact that they too had massive pieces of flesh removed from their original bodies. Both blood and a raw appearance could be seen in the wounds. An additional inquiry revealed that these wounds were self-inflicted and that they were not caused by their teeth, but rather by their hands. This was discovered after the study was carried out. Over the course of several hours, they had painstakingly removed sections of their own skin and muscles off their bodies. This was in addition to the fact that they had not been eating the flesh. It had been more than 5 days since anyone had any kind of interaction with the food that had been supplied for them. At first sight, it seemed as though they had completely lost their minds and had begun tearing themselves apart from one another for no apparent reason at all. During the time that the soldiers attempted to enter the chamber and remove the victims from it, the 4 people who had managed to escape fought back with a ferocity that was brutal on the part of the soldiers. While they were yelling and struggling, they were attempting to leave the room as quickly as they could. Furthermore, they did not stop asking with the specialists to turn on the gas supply whenever they made their request. Even though their bodies were famished, they fought with such a strong will, which is a testimonial to their condition. One of the subjects jumped at a soldier while they were engaged in the combat and used his teeth to rip into the soldier's throat. This occurred while they were engaged in the conflict. He was laying on the floor of the chamber, bleeding out, when the soldier passed away. He had been there for some time. In addition, one of the guys was involved in a fight that was so intense that he ruptured his own spleen and passed away as a result of internal bleeding right there in the middle of the commotion. While we were in the process of removing the subjects from the room, we discovered that 2 of them had already passed away. After finally gaining control of the situation, the 3 individuals who were still alive were shackled against their will and immediately sent to a nearby medical institution. They were in a precarious situation, both because of the wounds that they had inflicted on themselves and because of the terrible malnutrition that they were experiencing. It was determined that the individual who had incurred the most severe injuries out of the 3 needed to be taken to an operating room under emergency circumstances. While they were still being held under restraint, the other 2 were being held in a separate room. At the same time as the medical personnel were preparing the first patient for surgery, they attempted to calm him down by administering a standard sedative to him. This was done in an effort to bring about relaxation. Nevertheless, it did not have any effect whatsoever. It appeared as though he was unaffected by the danger. In spite of the fact that they supplied dosage after dosage, which was substantially more than a regular man would be able to tolerate, the situation did not change. While he was still struggling against his ties, he continued to plead for the gas and beg to be kept awake. He was also still struggling against his binding. In the end, the medical professionals arrived at the decision that they had no choice but to administer a general anesthetic in order to have him go through with the treatment. When they told him what they were about to do, he instantly started fighting back with even more intense brutality. He continued to fight until he was completely defeated. There was no desire on his part to undergo the anesthetic. His screams were loud and clear, and he insisted that he had to remain awake. It was during the midst of his frantic battle that he was able to gather an unusual amount of energy, which ultimately led to the breaking of one of these sturdy leather straps that was securing him to the table. It came as a shock to the specialists working in the medical field. During the time that they were delivering the anesthetic, it took a number of them to hold him down and prevent him from moving around. He needed to be given a dose that was more than 10 times larger than the average quantity in order for them to be successful in inducing him to lose consciousness. The moment his eyelids dropped and he started to nod off, his heart stopped beating. This occurred simultaneously. It was after the fact. All of the researchers were completely and utterly shocked. The next item that they discussed was the person who had a tear in his vocal cords. They moved on to the next topic. It was within the confines of the operating room that he was brought. In spite of the fact that he was unable to communicate verbally, he quickly shook his head in a nonchalant fashion upon seeing the anesthesia. In a manner that was identical to that of the first man, he fought with all of his might, flailing and struggling with all of his might. Because of the tremendous amount of effort that he put forth, he eventually gave in to exhaustion and passed out as a result of his exhaustion. His vital indicators remained the same at the time he lost consciousness, just as they had been the case with the previous topic. In addition to that, he has lost his life. In the present moment, there was only one subject that was still available. 2 of the 3 people who had survived had already passed away by the time they were rescued from the chamber, and both of them had passed away the instant they had closed their eyes and gone to sleep. After doing their research, the experts arrived at the conclusion that the symptoms they were experiencing were indeed caused by sleep itself. They came to the conclusion that the most recent survivor would not benefit from doing surgery. They could have decided to come up with a fresh approach as an alternative. After that, they would reset the gas supply and then place him back inside the chamber where he had been previously contained. Given the circumstances, it was quite probable that it was the sole factor that was preventing these men from going away. Before bringing him back into the chamber, it was decided that he would be connected to an electroencephalogram (EEG) machine so that they could monitor the activity of his brainwaves. One of the things that they conducted in the experiment was something that they had not done up until this point in the trial. Following the attachment of the electrodes to his scalp, they proceeded to activate the monitor and initiate the treatment further. At the same time that a green line was following the patterns of his brain activity, the researchers were observing the screen that was presenting the statistic. After then, they became aware of something that was not only odd, but also profoundly unsettling. The line on the electroencephalogram would periodically go entirely flat for a brief period of time, giving the impression that he was completely incapacitated and without any consciousness. Immediately after that, it would immediately resume its regular activity in a manner that was just as abrupt. There was a surge and decline, and then there was a plateau after that. There was a surge and decline, and then there was a plateau after that. During the time when one of these episodes of flatline occurred on the monitor, it just so happened that one of the researchers was looking at the subject himself. He saw the subject's eyelids entirely closed for a brief moment, but it was only for a fraction of a second. It was a brief period of time spent sleeping. He was literally going through a period of brain death each and every time he blinked or his eyes briefly fluttered shut, and this was happening over and over again. He was going through this process over and over again. The researchers were finally made aware of the terrible reality that they had been living with. Because of the combination of the gas and the awful lack of sleep that they had been suffering, their bodies had undergone significant changes. This was the outcome of the combination of the 2 factors. They were no longer responding to it as a therapeutic process. Rather, it was a process that ultimately proved to be fatal for them. After they realized that the final victim was on the verge of experiencing the same fate as the others, they made a frenzied run to get him back inside the chamber and resume the gas. They eventually succeeded in doing so. A furious race against time was taking place in order for them to recover their last piece of data, which was also their last survivor. They were trying to save it no matter what. On the other hand, it was already quite late. As a result of the consequences of the preparations that were being made for the chamber, the body of the victim ultimately succumbed to the effects. He fell into a deep and restful sleep as he drifted off to sleep. As the researchers observed the EEG monitor, they were filled with a spooky sense of wonder. For a limited period of time, the brain waves that are indicative of a significant amount of deep slumber were exhibited on the screen. He had been waiting for a period of more than 15 days before he was finally able to enjoy a night of pure sleep. After a certain point, the line reached a point where it was completely flat. Suddenly, his heart stopped beating. It was after the fact. Every one of the 5 topics had vanished as a direct consequence of this. The disastrous failure of the experiment had resulted in the deaths of a total of 6 individuals, including the soldier. These deaths were a direct consequence of the failed experiment. The researchers were left with a mountain of worrying data at the end of the day, but they did not have any answers that could be considered definitive. In what specific ways did the gas affect them, and how did it affect them? What caused them to go insane and rewire their biology to make resting a potentially dangerous condition? Might it have been the stimulant itself, or might it have been the prolonged and complete lack of sleep that had led them to become insane? There was no way that they would ever be able to provide an answer to the question that was being asked. During a period of extreme desperation, the documents of the experiment were buried, and the story was covered up. This was a terrible secret that was kept hidden from the public. When the unrelenting pursuit of knowledge crosses the boundaries of ethics and enters the murky unknown of the human mind, it serves as a sobering reminder of the potential outcomes that could occur as a consequence of this. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting till the next time we meet again. What's going on? In 2006, Susan Lewis and her daughter Jamie discovered the perfect Southern California home in a quiet community. They immediately loved the modest, perfectly sized house. Their home was a haven where they could start a new life. Matt, Susan's new boyfriend, joined them shortly after they moved there, improving things. It started a blended family. Matt and Jamie got along well, which relieved Susan. Matt also had a daughter, Marie, Jamie's age. Immediate friendship formed between the girls. Everything was wonderful briefly. Susan and Matt were happy, the daughters were happy, and this little house was the shelter they needed. This idyllic family started a new chapter. That ideal picture was about to be shattered, starting with a jar of peanut butter. Matt, Jamie, and Marie were enjoying the pool on a sunny summer day a few weeks after everyone had settled in. They were laughing, splashing, and having fun. Susan took a break from the festivities to make lunch for everyone inside. As she entered the kitchen, she spotted it. The kitchen counter had a peanut butter jar on its side. A lid was off. Not the strangest part. Peanut butter poured out of the jar like a liquid. As if melted, it gently oozed across the countertop and dripped into the floor. Susan felt the kitchen air. It was warm, but not hot enough to melt peanut butter. Her first thought was that a child did it. Maybe they came inside, microwaved the peanut butter for some odd reason, and left it as a prank. Anger drove her to the rear door to call for her daughter. "Jamie, get in here!" Jamie, still dripping from the water, entered bewildered. "What, Mom?" she asked. Susan pointed to the counter mess. Jamie later said she chuckled at her mom's silly question. "Did you do this?" "Why would I?" she asked. Susan asked, "Well, I don't know." "Do you know if Marie did this?" Jamie shakes her head. "No, we've been outside the whole time." Susan sent her outside and called Marie, believing her daughter. Like Jamie, Marie was confused as she entered. She replied, "No, I didn't touch the peanut butter. Susan looked from the mess to the two innocent girls. She sighed. She thought one of them wouldn't admit it, but it was a lovely day, and she didn't want a spilled jar of peanut butter to ruin it. It was rationalized in her head. One of the youngsters may have knocked it over accidentally and been too scared to admit it. It may have melted because the kitchen was warmer than she thought. She convinced herself there were a dozen rational answers. It turned out she didn't care enough to make a big deal. Susan returned outside after 10 minutes of cleaning up the sticky, oily mess, and the four of them spent the afternoon in the sun and pool. Once the sun fell, they headed inside. The moment they entered, they sensed something was seriously wrong. After leaving, the house was different. Cans of pantry food were stacked on every second-floor stairwell. Some beans, maize, and soup cans were stacked haphazardly, forming a quiet obstacle course. But it continued. Random objects in odd patterns littered the house as they entered. Shampoo and conditioner bottles were arranged in a teetering pyramid on the tub edge. They had a flawless star pattern of hairbrushes and combs on the counter. They opened the microwave and found several peanut butter jars, some vegetable cans, and even some of the girls' teddy animals. The cleaning materials were neatly lined up on the floor under the kitchen sink, from shortest to tallest. Next came walls. Sprayed and splattered strange liquids covered the living room and kitchen walls. It looked like ketchup, mustard, or other sauces, but they weren't sure. Shampoo and soap stains made the walls slimy and sticky. Their immediate impression was that an intruder had broken into their home and robbed them. They hurried back outside, hearts racing, and searched the land. But nobody was there. Nobody had entered the residence all afternoon. They would have seen a car or person enter their driveway. Confusion and fear led them to capture what they saw. They returned inside and took pictures and videos of the unusual scenes on their phone. This is why we have so many photos today. None of it made sense to them. Their thinking told them this was a hoax, but who would pull it? Jamie was suspicious by Matt immediately. He assumed his non-biological daughter was behaving out. Susan thought it was Marie, Matt's daughter. Matt and Susan had a terrible fight over this quick blame game. It started a serious breakup in a nice blended family, and things became worse. Try to imagine their situation. Parents don't want to believe in supernatural events. Some kid is responsible, which is the most plausible but painful answer. If it's not a child, a stranger was in your home touching your things. What if it's not an intruder? The idea was too terrible to consider. So they believed the other person's child was guilty. They were convinced beyond reason. This conviction and need to blame someone prevented them from calling the police, which they should have done immediately. That call never happened. Instead, they began the laborious cleanup. They spent hours cleaning up the house while a dense, seething stillness permeated the air. After finishing, they sought to go on like denial-stricken folks. However, their sanctuary's weird events continued. About a week passed. The house was still tense, but they were attempting to forget the can and sauce incident. Jamie and Marie tried to spend time together one afternoon in Jamie's room. Marie worked on homework at a desk next to the bed. Jamie poured her freshly brewed coffee on the desk next to Marie. "I have to go use the bathroom. I'll be right back," she added. She turned and left the room, disappearing for a while. Marie returned with her head down, looking preoccupied with studying. Jamie returned into the room and discovered the coffee cup gone from the desk. Her white bedspread was covered in dark brown coffee when it was thrown. The room was empty except for Marie. Jamie became furious. "Marie, what are you doing?" "Why did you throw my coffee all over the bed?" Marie looked up from her schoolwork, stunned. She asked, "What are you talking about?" After following Jamie's gaze to the bed, she appeared as astonished as Jamie. "I didn't do that," she said. Jamie didn't trust her. This seemed like another of her odd tricks to garner attention, as she still believed Marie had made the large mess in the house the week before. Jamie left the room for cleaning supplies, frustrated. Her bleach bottle was placed on her dresser when she returned. Open dresser drawers held her clothes. She placed the bleach bottle upright on the smooth wood. She then took up the empty coffee mug from the bed and put it on the desk. She froze when she turned to grab bleach. She was spilling bleach over her clothes in her open drawers because the cap had been unscrewed. A constant flow of transparent, corrosive liquid ruined everything. Jamie could see Marie sitting on the chair the whole time. She remained still. Jamie was convinced it wasn't Marie. She screamed. Marie screamed when she saw bleach everywhere. Susan ran inside the room after hearing the noise, screamed, "What's going on in here?" The frightened girls tried to explain what happened, but their statements were inaccurate. A wall-mounted picture frame tumbled to the floor as the three of them stared at the damaged garments. It startled them all. Another picture fell after they stared at the empty wall. A loose nail or poster dropping could be a coincidence. However, two photographs descending simultaneously felt different. Susan witnessed the photos falling, the bleach and coffee, and her daughter and stepdaughter's utter terror. She grabbed both females and they fled. They hurried out of the home, got in the car, and drove away without a destination. They realized they couldn't stay in that house. A huge plot twist occurred. Jamie and Marie had silently accused each other of the strange events until now. Though they never stated it, it helped them make sense of the turmoil. Susan had been mentally blaming one or both girls. Now that she had seen the portraits come off the wall, Susan was beginning to suspect that something supernatural was happening in their home. Jamie and Marie were convinced. They were the first to express it as they drove aimlessly. They suspected their home was haunted. Susan and the girls drove home when they calmed down. Matt was at work all day and didn't know what happened. They returned inside with heavy hearts. The house failed again. Cans stacked up the stairs, stuff in unusual patterns on the floor, the microwave was filled of various goods, and the refrigerator door was open, spilling food onto the kitchen floor. Strange, sticky liquids covered the walls again. No one was responsible this time. Susan, Jamie, and Marie spent the entire vehicle ride together. Matt wasn't home, so none of them were it. Their terror was heightened by this fresh proof, coffee, bleach, and falling photos. The concept of a haunted house became unsettling. Matt returned home that night to turmoil and 3 worried family members. Instead of worrying, he got more persuaded that this was a prank. He hadn't seen the bleach pour alone, not seeing the images fall from the wall. All he saw was his girlfriend, Susan, believing this crazy claim that their house was haunted. Matt was a skeptic and refused to entertain any other explanation other than his girlfriend's trick. He and Susan had a huge fight. He claimed she encouraged the youngsters' imaginations. She said that he didn't comprehend and that the house was broken. They yelled at each other. They cleaned the house again while fighting, taking forever. The idyllic family was shattered at the end. Susan and Matt loathed each other, the kids were squabbling, and their sanctuary was gloomy and oppressive. Things worsened that night. The house lost power instantly. They were plunged into darkness and heard doors banging open and shut all night. The electric ignition on their stove kept clicking, as if trying to light a burner. They couldn't turn it off. Bang, 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 click, click all night. They saw all this paranormal activity and recorded part of it, but fear and unbelief paralyzed them. Nobody knew what to do. From the outside, it's simple to suggest they should have contacted the police or left the house. However, a situation like that upends your universe. This challenges all you thought you knew about reality. Your brain switches on denial to cope. Instead of uniting against whatever was in their house, they fought and blamed each other for the things that were clearly happening in front of them, things that had nothing to do with them. Susan, Matt, and the girls hadn't notified their friends or relatives yet. They were humiliated and afraid of being disbelieved. Susan finally snapped the next day. She told a close friend everything. Peanut butter, cans, bleach, smashing doors. Her friend listened carefully and gave odd advice. Maybe you should try giving it a peace offering, she added. Maybe this thing in your house feels like you're intruding on its space. If you offer it something to show you mean no harm, that you want to coexist, maybe it'll stop. Whether this advice was good or not, Susan felt in control for the first time. She embraced the notion. Matt would be at work that day, so she knew he would never approve. It would start another fight when he called it absurd. So she saw an opening. She told the girls the plan. Susan chose a little porcelain cat figurine for the offering. Cats were her passion, so she thought offering them would be powerful. She said, "We mean no harm. Let's call a truce." She set up a little table with candles and a cat figurine in the middle. Observing her, the females were unsure what to think. Susan talked from the heart since she didn't know what to say or how to ritualize. "Please accept this gift," she told the empty room. "It's my gift to you. We mean no harm, and we want to coexist." Fate brought Matt home quickly. The noise had kept him up the night before, and he was so sick and fatigued that he left work early. He entered his house and observed Susan and the girls performing a séance. He was mad. "Definitely not," he said. "We are not going to interact with this thing. We're not going to act like it's real, because it's not." He stepped to the table and saw the cat figurine was the focus. Susan and the girls begged him, "Don't do anything! Don't touch it!" But Matt ignored them. He grabbed the figurine from the table, went to the back deck, and flung it into their backyard. Susan and daughters cried. He had made things worse, and they were afraid. All eyes were on the backyard where the cat landed. But they turned and glanced at the table. They all gasped. The same cat figurine was in the middle of the table where it had been seconds earlier. It was impossible. Everyone had seen Matt chuck it. Matt refused to change. He didn't care. He ran back over, grabbed the new figure, and tossed it on the floor, shattering it into 100 pieces. The violence and aggression were the reverse of Susan's peace offering. At that moment, Susan felt a sickening feeling in her stomach and knew they would suffer for what he had done. Jamie woke up in the middle of the night after everyone had wept themselves to sleep. She discreetly went downstairs to the kitchen for water because she was thirsty. Her blood chilled when she entered and turned on the light. The kitchen walls were covered in ketchup-like writing that repeated one word: cat. She saw cat everywhere. She shouted and went upstairs, waking everyone. Everyone descended and saw the signs. Matt instantly faced Jamie. "You're the one that found this." "You did this," he said. Susan defended Jamie. "You're the one who smashed the cat figurine, Matt." "No wonder this is happening." It escalated into another terrible brawl, with everyone screaming and blinded by rage and terror. They were haunted and could only pull each other apart. Beyond the writing on the walls, the residence was looted again. The contents of every drawer were spilled on the floor. Every closet was open, clothes scattered. Extremely messy, unlike anything they had seen before. Nobody had woken up. Everyone slept in their beds and heard nothing. It wasn't rational. As they began another unpleasant kitchen cleanup, they shifted some objects and found something new. A large, muddy footprint was on the linoleum floor. It was bigger than Matt's foot and not Susan's or the girls'. It was a giant man's footprint, or something else. Again, we can easily ask why they didn't go. When in chronic turmoil, your brain craves normalcy. A coping method. They did nothing. They cleaned up the debris, washed cat off their walls, and tried to survive in a house they couldn't afford to leave. Family dynamics had collapsed by this stage. The kids were shy and terrified. Marie and Jamie stayed in their rooms all day. Matt and Susan barely spoke. The house was now a jail, and everyone was sad. In the last 2 weeks of their time in that residence, 2 frightening events forced them out forever. Marie experienced it first. One evening, she was home alone for 2 hours. Susan and Matt hated leaving her, but they had to. Jamie went out with buddies. As night fell, Marie was home alone. Similar to a horror film scene. TV was her distraction in the living room. TVs started turning off and on suddenly. Fast, rhythmic, on, off, on. She understood from experience that this was a terrible sign indicating trouble. She couldn't turn the TV back on after it fully switched off. The remote flew off the coffee table and skidded across the floor as she reached for it. She was stuck in fear, sitting there. She knew others were there. She then watched in terror as the empty rocking chair in the corner of the room started rocking slowly, then more vigorously, as if an invisible person had just sat down and was watching her. Marie watched the rocking chair as the portraits on the walls fell to the floor one by one. Marie and Jamie started carrying a digital camera around to chronicle weird events. Marie grabbed her camera while scared on the couch. With shaking hands, she aimed it around the room and started taking shots, trying to capture something. She ran for her phone and called Susan, her dad, and anyone who answered. She said, "You have to get here now." "Something's happening!" Susan and Jamie ran home to find Marie huddled on the couch, scared but unharmed. The house was thrown again. After things calmed down, Marie remembered the camera. "I took pics," she stated. The small computer screen displayed her images, which they viewed together. She appeared in numerous photos with weird, dazzling orbs of light in the living area. Their movement around the room was obvious. It proved something was there. It was the last straw for Matt. He could no longer deny it. Pictures showed his daughter was terrorized. He eventually believed their home was haunted. The church was his first stop because he didn't know who to call. He contacted priests and pastors to invite guests to the house. He could only get one priest to pray with the family for a few minutes before declaring, "I can't help you," and leaving. They were alone in a house they couldn't afford to leave, with a growing threat. Jamie's second major event, which broke them, occurred at home alone. In her bedroom, she heard a loud door hammering. Thump, thump, thump. Nobody else was home, she knew. Fearful, she grabbed her camera and filmed the door, recording her frightened breaths. Someone was repeatedly knocking on her bedroom door. She knew she had to check the hall. She moved toward the door, her heart racing, gathering the confidence to turn the handle. The beating on the other side stopped when her hand approached the doorknob as if it knew what she was about to do. The beating resumed when she retracted her hand. She went back to her bed and curled up in the fetal position for 3 hours, listening to somebody bashing her door. The banging ceased abruptly. Jamie believed she could depart the house after a few minutes of silence. She crept back to the door, cautiously turning the knob and opening it. The hallway was vacant. No one was there. When she peered outside her door, she saw a huge dent in the wood where the pounding had occurred. It appeared that a huge force had bent the hallway doorknob downward. A filthy mound of pots, pans, silverware, and knives covered the hall floor. It appeared that something was trying to smash her door with tools. The doorknob to the restroom next to her room was gone, leaving a space where you could look through. They hadn't replaced it yet. The bathroom light flickered as Jamie stood in the corridor. "It's in there," she thought. In an odd flash of boldness, she decided to trap it. She hurried back to her desk, grabbed thread, and returned to the restroom door. She threaded the string through the doorknob hole, closed the door, and leaned back, thinking she had trapped it. When the door closed, she sensed resistance. Something was retreating. An invisible pull tugged at her. She fell backwards into her room when the string snapped. Bathroom doors crashed open. She imagined she would meet whatever was frightening her family. She was trapped in her bedroom when her bedroom door banged before she could see anything from the bathroom. She heard pans rustling and metal clinking outside her door. It interacted with its hallway tool pile. She noticed smoke enter her room from under the door after a moment. She went to the door and threw it open. She observed a frying pan with a burned roll of toilet paper in the hallway. Like a fuse, toilet paper was scattered along the corridor. This creature tried to burn the hallway. She was now completely survival-oriented. It now wanted to kill her, not terrify her. She used a hoodie from her room to extinguish the pan fire. She carefully crossed the corridor, tearing away the toilet paper, preparing to face this dreadful thing at any moment. She entered the living room and spotted toilet paper, paper towels, and newspapers. Her house was prepared to burn down with her inside. She hurried out the front door after navigating the maze of flammable items, searching for other fires. She sobbed on the front steps and waited for her family to come home. Jamie was screaming violently on the steps when Susan, Matt, and Marie returned. They ran inside, saw the toilet paper and burn marks, and Jamie recounted what happened. The end. That ended it. They knew to leave. They couldn't afford to move and knew it would ruin them, but they had no alternative. They packed only what they needed and left the house and its contents. House never sold. Susan went bankrupt. Strange things happened after they went. Next-door neighbors moved. The neighboring household moved. 5 nearby households pack up and leave. Not one of their homes sold. They remain empty, and no one knows why. Even though they were broke, Susan, Matt, Jamie, and Marie were glad to leave. Since leaving that house, they never experienced any paranormal activity again and are happy they survived. 911 dispatchers are prepared to handle banal and alarming calls. But Reno, Nevada dispatchers may have received the creepiest 911 calls ever. An elderly couple resided in a modest house 20 miles east of Reno. In 2010, her spouse died, leaving her alone at home. She started calling 911 twice or 3 times a week following his death. She didn't call for emergencies. She asked for things like, "Can you please put some water on to boil for my tea?" and "Could you come over and change the thermostat? It's a bit chilly." The dispatchers knew she had dementia. They always talked gently and told her 911 was for emergencies. She always seemed to understand, apologize, and hang up. These calls were confused and not emergencies, therefore first responders were never sent to her house. No matter how many times they explained it, she continued phoning. Her calls changed eventually. Instead of asking for help with routine domestic tasks, she called 911 thinking she was talking to her deceased husband, John. Dispatchers would answer the phone and hear her say, "John? Where are you? John, please come home." By now, they were so familiar with her that her address would appear up on their screen and they knew who it was. A protocol governed her calls. They answered politely and repeated their script. "Ma'am, this is 911. You can't call this number unless it's an emergency. You need to talk to your family." They didn't send a response unit again because she sounded confused, not in danger. Her tone changed when her number called one day. She sounded panicked and afraid. "John, please come home." "Help me." "I need help, John. Come home." Her worried cry prompted the dispatcher to send first responders to her house for a welfare check. A few minutes later, the responding police unit pounded loudly on her front door and called her name. No response. Complete silence filled the house. The door was unlocked when they turned the knob. After identifying themselves as police, they entered. They immediately noticed how cold the house was. It was obvious the heat was off. They checked the first level but couldn't find her. No struggle or unusual behavior was observed. They walked upstairs to examine rooms. Each room was unoccupied until the master bedroom. The elderly woman was on the bed when they opened the door. Her death was obvious. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body after death, made her look dead for hours. The officers confirmed that the woman on the bed was the house owner and 911 caller. They updated the dispatch center by calling back. They told the dispatcher, "The woman you said made that 911 call a few minutes ago, it couldn't have been her. Based on the state of the body, she was already dead at the time that call was made." But the dispatchers insisted. "No way," they said. "We know what she sounds like. We talk to her multiple times a week. We have a whole procedure for her. The call that led you to that house was made by her." It was her voice. Police and dispatchers debated the discrepancies. They reached a rational conclusion. Not real rigor mortis, they decided. Her house was frigid, making her stiff. They assumed she called 911 and died in the few minutes it took officers to arrive. It was a reasonable explanation, but everyone was a little scared. A few days later, 911 was called again. The dispatcher noticed the deceased woman's home address on the screen. Double take. It wasn't possible. They assumed a relative or friend was at the house. Blood chilled when the dispatcher answered. It was her. She screamed for her spouse in the same voice. "John, come here! Save me. Help me!" The dispatcher followed procedure and stayed calm despite knowing the whole background and that this woman was supposed to be dead. The call ended abruptly when they tried to acquire further information from her. They sent a crew to inspect the house since they had no other choice. Responding cops returned to the property. Knocked on the door. No reply. The door was unlocked from their last visit. The house was empty when they entered. Nobody there could have made that call. At this moment, the dispatch center suspected a terrible trick. The next day, it happened again. Another call from the dead woman's home. The same frantic voice begged for her spouse and for aid when they picked it up. The dispatcher tried to keep her on the line again, but it cut out. They sent officers again after a 911 plea for help. Another unoccupied house greeted the cops. As before, she received calls many times a week. Vandals broke into and burnt her empty house, but they continued. It was a burnt-out lot with no house, but 911 calls came from that location. Finally, police told the phone company about the strange scenario. The phone company examined its records and found that the woman's line was cut nearly immediately after her death. However, they told the police that the number may have been functional because the line was possibly not severed correctly at the spot. So they sent a lineman to inspect the property. The lineman checked the connections at the burned-out lot and reported that everything was correctly removed. The phone company suggested another option. Maybe a digital recording of her voice got stuck in their system and was arbitrarily sent to 911. The dispatchers rejected this idea. They stated it didn't sound like a loop. She always yelled for her husband to save her, but her voice changed. Her voice, accent, and terror level were different every time she called. As there was no clear cause, the dispatch center had to treat every call as an emergency. They got ghost calls many times a week for a year. Every time, they had to send police to check on a vacant, burned-down lot, knowing no one was there. Finally, exactly 1 year after the woman died, the calls ceased. They never got another. The calls weren't a threat, therefore the cops didn't investigate. Very strange. The official explanation for a dead woman calling 911 from a non-existent phone line in a non-existent residence for a year is, we don't know. Dave Murphy was a young Salt Lake City police officer in 2006. His first job was providing physical security for government sites as a protective service officer. The Capital City Theater, a Salt Lake City institution since the early 1900s, was Dave's first assignment. Dave started working at the theater in early August. There, he met his partner, Morgan Matthews, an experienced officer. Dave later said Morgan was business from the start. Though cordial, he was frigid. Morgan escorted Dave first to the control room on the first floor of the three-story theater. There was a vast basement below the structure. All the theater's security cameras were monitored in the control room. The cameras were ancient and low quality. At night, most lights were off, so you could only see the screen if a light was on. Morgan told Dave they had to conduct their rounds after the quick control room tour. "This is what we do at the beginning and end of every shift," he said. "We walk the entire building, make sure every door is locked and every light is off." Morgan took Dave to the basement. Dave was amazed by its size when he saw it for the first time. The lengthy hallway seemed to go on forever into the darkness. A piano sat alone in this big, empty hall. Poor lighting and musty air were down there. Dave recalls feeling creeped out immediately. The dark hallway with closed doors and the piano in the middle was disturbing. "I don't want to spend much time down here," he thought. After inspecting each door, they returned up the corridor to examine the first, second, and third floors. The rest of their shift was spent in the control room after the security round. Dave wanted to get to know his new partner, but Morgan was icy and uninterested in small talk. Dave observed Morgan seemed nearly frantic to finish the last rounds and leave the building as their shift ended. After that first night, Dave had a peculiar sense that Morgan hated the theater. It took Morgan a while to explain why he was right. Dave's training included security rounds with Morgan over the next 2 days. Morgan concluded 2 days after Dave started that Dave knew the building well enough to tackle the final rounds alone on August 9. "Morgan, why don't you take this one?" Dave felt confident and patrolled the scary basement. After locking the doors and turning out the lights, he checked the first floor's rooms, including the main auditorium. He went to the second floor to examine the rooms and balcony, then to the third floor for the staff offices. He finished his checklist with the practice room. This open doorway was the only room in the building without a door. Just pop your head in, look around, and leave. Dave went to the rehearsal room, turned on the light, and looked in. The room was vacant. Once satisfied, he turned out the light and turned back into the corridor to go when a door across the hall banged shut violently. It was the bathroom door. His first impression was that someone was fleeing the building after sheltering there. He instinctively grabbed his radio and phoned Morgan. Morgan heard someone's on the third floor, but saw no one on the hallway video. Dave had grabbed his gun and was examining the dark hallway. He didn't see runners. While waiting for Morgan to save him, he thought about 2 things. First, hearing the door bang didn't mean the person ran out. They may still be in the bathroom. Second, he remembered from his training that the bathroom door had a heavy-duty hydraulic hinge. That door could not close. He was aiming his revolver at the bathroom door when Morgan emerged at the top of the stairs with his weapon. They entered the bathroom and cleared every stall and corner. No one was there. There was no escape. Okay, they thought, they must have run out of the bathroom before slamming the door. They're somewhere else in the theater. They searched the entire building. They left the bathroom with pistols drawn and checked all third-floor doors. All was locked. Dave could see via the stairway door window that the second-floor lights were on as they descended. He recalled turning them off minutes earlier. "Did you turn on the second-floor lights?" Morgan shook his head. "No." They assumed the bathroom occupant ran to the second level and turned them on. When they entered the second story, all the lights were on and every door was open. They searched every room, closet, and crevice. Nobody was there. They switched out all lights, locked all doors, and kept searching. Lights off, doors locked, the first floor was perfect. They descended to the basement. As they searched for an intruder, the creepiness increased. They searched every room, but found no one. Back in the control room, they reviewed third-floor surveillance footage. The camera wasn't pointed toward the restroom door, and the corridor was too dark to view. The footage only shows the practice room light flashing on and off and the door slamming loudly. They couldn't explain. They were afraid that someone was still in the building. One more thorough search yielded nothing. They gave up and left, calling it a bizarre, unexplained experience. Morgan worked alone on August 11th, 2 days later. Off day for Dave. Morgan perceived whispers from the hallway behind him while in the control room. After the door slammed, he was hypervigilant. He exited the hallway with his pistol. After he did, the whispering sound moved down the hall away from him. Nothing was visible when he peered around. He slowly walked down the corridor to the basement stairway. As he climbed the steps, he heard someone coughing from the basement. Morgan now acknowledged to being afraid. After all the strange things that had been happening, being alone in this vast, ancient theater and hearing coughing from the spooky basement was unnerving. He slowly descended the stairs with his rifle pointing ahead. He stopped coughing as he turned the corner at the bottom of the stairs. He turned on the lights and saw a long, deserted hallway. There was nothing. He checked all the doors as he walked down the corridor. Farther down the cellar, he smelled smoke. It came from a locked door next to him. He entered expecting a fire after unlocking the door. Despite the strong smoke scent, the room was empty and there was no fire. He examined the little room with the light on but found nothing. He searched every room in the basement, convinced there was a fire. There was nothing. The smoke smell vanished as quickly as it appeared. He searched the auditorium for fires, but found none. He pondered phoning the fire department, but what would he say? He had to assume he smelled something. A few weeks later, on September 4, Dave arrived early for his shift at the theater. He spotted 3 employees speaking at the front desk when he entered. He overheard one talking about theater spirits as he passed. He was immediately intrigued. He approached the chatting man and introduced himself. Blair Fuller was the theater's senior accountant. Dave asked, "What's this about ghosts?" "I'm a security officer here, and I've seen some strange things myself." Blair invited Dave to his third-floor office to explain. "Okay," Blair said, "I've got a story for you. This happened a couple of years ago. I was right here in this office working late. It was about 9 or 10 at night, and I heard the elevator kick on. A loud elevator engine was always visible outside Blair's office. He didn't think much of it until he realized he was the only one in the building. The lights above the elevator door indicated the floor from his office window. It rose from the basement. It halted on the 3rd floor after the first 2. No one was there when the doors opened. Blair claimed he wasn't worried. He thought there was scheduled maintenance. The elevator alarm, which sounds when something blocks the entrance, went off after a while. He heard the loud ringing from his window, but saw nothing in the entryway. From his office, he walked to the elevator. He reported the temperature plummeted when he entered. The elevator was cold. He turned to face his office, and the doors closed. He said he didn't get off. It was his choice to ride. The elevator went down when the basement button lit up, obviously pressed. He wondered, what in the world is going on? The basement elevator opens. The place is empty. He entered the eerie underground hall. He shouted, "Hey, is anyone down here?" with all his courage. No one responded. Only light came from the open elevator car. He scarcely saw the piano in the hall. He looked both ways. Nothing. He was so scared that he climbed back in the elevator and repeatedly punched the 3rd floor and door close buttons. He ascended after the doors closed. He returned to his office, closed the door, and sat, heart thumping. While trying to understand what happened, he heard a tremendous banging sound outside his office. His door opened, and he peered out. His eyes fell on a large metal filing cabinet in the entrance with all its drawers open. That was not his doing. He watched as the hefty drawers closed themselves one by one. Bang, 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 until they all closed. He tried opening a drawer to test whether it would close itself, but it didn't. Something must have closed it. He then left with his belongings. He never worked another theater night shift. Dave informed Morgan of Blair's remarks later that night. Morgan surprised him by opening up. He said, "You know, even before you started working here, I always felt like I was being watched in this building. And then we had that experience with the slamming door and the lights. And just a few days ago, when I was here alone, I heard voices and someone coughing in the basement, and I smelled smoke. They were finally open about how uncomfortable they felt." Dave thought of it. "My best friend, Greg, said, I'll invite him over one night. We'll tell him we're just giving him a tour, and we won't say anything about the strange stuff. We'll just see if he notices anything. If something happens, we'll have another witness to validate it." Morgan agreed with him. The next day, Dave's friend Greg came for his tour. They started in the main auditorium and went to the basement. Morgan and Dave observed an open door down the long corridor when Morgan turned on the light at the top of the stairs. They were certain that door should be locked. They pulled Greg behind them, drew their pistols, and moved down the hall to the door. The door banged in front of them as they left. 3 shocked people stared at each other. Before they could act, the doorknob rattled fiercely. A few seconds later, the rattling ceased. Dave and Morgan understood they had to enter. Greg followed them since he was afraid in the hall alone. They entered the little room with pistols drawn, but found no one. Greg exclaimed and pointed to a corner. He murmured, "Someone's sitting in the corner." After turning around, Dave and Morgan aimed their weapons at the corner, but saw nothing. "I just saw someone," Greg said. One of them said, "He was wearing a hood, like a sweatshirt." He was right there. Greg was seeing things after they brought him in to disprove the oddity. They left, locked, and headed upstairs swiftly. "I'm out of here," Greg remarked, leaving. All the weird episodes were reported, but Dave and Morgan framed them as break-ins, not hauntings. The county installed a new theater security camera system with infrared night vision. Morgan worked alone on September 15th to install the new cameras. He was in the control room testing the new equipment and seeing camera feed. An image on a television drew his attention. Main auditorium camera. The zoomed-out camera made it hard to discern if someone was sitting in a seat. He zoomed in and saw a guy seated with a hood. Morgan saw bright eyes staring at the camera as the person slowly moved its head. The figure suddenly rose, drifting toward the ceiling, disappearing. Morgan finished. He didn't probe. He didn't request assistance. He packed up, left the theater, and quit his job that day. A few weeks later, Dave worked alone at the theater. He heard a piano playing suddenly in the control room. Basement piano was the sole piano in the building. He pulled his gun and exited the control room because he had to investigate. As he approached the basement stairs, the piano music increased. As he downed the stairs, he heard the piano key's wooden cover close and the music stop just before he turned the corner into the long hallway. He turned the corner, turned on the lights, and surveyed the hall. Nobody was there. He realized he would never find anyone. Whatever haunted the theater. That satisfied Dave. He returned upstairs, locked himself in the control room until his shift ended, and left. The next day, he told his sergeant, "You can never assign me to that theater again, or I will quit." He was reassigned immediately. No full-time security officer worked at the theater for 2 months. The role was finally filled by veteran police officer Josh Thomas on November 26th. Dave drove near the theater on his first night of duty. Josh's voice suddenly rang out over the radio. I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater. Dave already suspected otherwise. He didn't want to return, but he had to warn the new guy. Josh was standing outside a rear door, terrified, when Dave came. Josh said he heard voices in the basement while making rounds. On the third story, he observed the elevator rise from the basement by itself. It was vacant when the doors opened. When the door alarm went off unexpectedly, he called for help. Dave said, "Look, let's just search the building together." They searched the theater, but discovered nothing. Before Dave left, they were conversing on the big auditorium stage. Josh faced Dave when his back was to the audience. Josh paused, mid-sentence, transfixed, and stared at something above Dave's shoulder. "What?" asked Dave. Josh murmured, "There's something behind you." Dave carefully turned. A man stood in the dark theater's rear. He was hooded and faced away. The figure turned rapidly and faced them. Deep, dark, sunken eyes and a black, scorched face suggested it had been terribly burned. The stranger glanced at them before turning and rushing out of the theater's rear. Josh thought it was an intruder, but Dave knew better. They checked the building again, but discovered no shrouded figure. Dave sat Josh down in the control room and told him everything, his, Morgan's, and Blair's. Dave later researched the theater's history. His research revealed a devastating 1940s fire in the structure. A man trapped in the basement died in the fire. Dave, Morgan, and Josh believed they were seeing the ghost of that man still haunting his grave. 6 DeFeo family members were asleep in their beds in calm suburban Amityville, New York on the 13th of November, 1974. The 7th family member, 23-year-old Ron DeFeo Jr., was awake in his basement room. He got out of bed at 1 a.m., grabbed a powerful gun, and climbed the stairs. He reached the second-floor landing after climbing the second flight of steps. He went straight to his parents' bedroom. A little candle on his father's bedside table illuminated the room. Ron shot his father twice in the back with the rifle. After his father stopped, he shot his mother twice with the rifle. He left the room calmly and crossed the hall to his 2 younger brothers' bedroom. He fired 1 shot at his 1-2-year-old brother Mark with the weapon again. He then fired 1 shot at his 9-year-old brother John. His 3-year-old sister Allison was asleep in another bedroom down the hall when he exited their room. He shot once with the rifle. After leaving her room, he went up a 3rd set of stairs to the 3rd story, located his 8-year-old sister Dawn, and shot her 1 last time. Ron DeFeo Jr. killed his family in 15 minutes. He was calm and collected. He casually moved from room to room, taking well-aimed shots. He dropped the firearm, stepped outside, and sprinted to a neighboring pub. He raced inside and yelled that he had just returned home to discover his family shot and needed help. He refused to enter the house when bar patrons followed him. They entered and saw the horror. Ron immediately confessed, "I killed my family," to the police. Ron Jr. was the most notoriously dysfunctional DeFeo. His explosive, angry temper and extensive drug and alcohol usage were well known. People avoided him. Amityville was unsurprised when Ron was found guilty of murdering the entire family. As crime scene details emerged, folks wondered if there was more to the story. All 6 victims were found face down in their beds. None exhibited evidence of fighting their attacker. Investigators initially thought Ron drugged them before killing them. No family members had narcotics or sedatives in their systems when toxicology findings came back. This didn't bother police at first. They assumed the family in the other rooms didn't hear the gunshots. Ron utilized a .35 caliber Marlin, one of the loudest guns available. Investigators tested the identical gun inside a house and found that it could be heard from a mile away. The detectives concluded that the family heard the gunshots, which was alarming. What was happening must have been known. None got out of bed for some reason. They didn't flee, hide, or fight. All they did was wait in bed. Ron's confession was odd. He informed authorities that he heard a voice in his head while lying in his basement bed, unable to sleep the night of the murders. The voice said, "Kill them." He believed he was going crazy. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness under the basement stairs and approached him. Ron saw this creature stroll up to his bed, bend down, and whisper, "Kill them." He said he lost control of his body at that point. Involuntarily, he grabbed the gun next to his bed, rose up, and headed upstairs. He knew he was going to kill his family and didn't want to, but he had no choice. He claimed to be possessed by a basement demon. Ron's tale horrified Amityville, but a demon-possessed mansion didn't hold up in court. His 6 murder convictions earned him life in jail. The Lutz family moved into the notorious mansion a year later. After 28 days, they fled in terror, claiming supernatural forces were tormenting them, including cellar voices. After then, famous demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated the property. They swiftly confirmed the house was haunted. The Amityville house is one of the most haunted in the world. Lorraine captured a famous photo while the Warrens investigated. She was taking infrared photos on the 2nd floor near the bedroom where the 2 boys were killed. She and her husband Ed were alone in the house. One photo of the processed film showed a young boy with luminous eyes peering out of a doorway. Lorraine has long maintained the boy in the picture is 9-year-old John DeFeo's ghost. The house still stands in Amityville and has been sold many times. No one seems to like living there long. Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. This is a story that has fascinated people for decades. It's one of those cases that, no matter how you look at it, it just doesn't seem to make sense. In 1979, the New York Times called it one of the Western world's most convincing cases of reincarnation. Now, a lot of stories about past lives are hard to verify. There's usually no real proof you can point to today. But this one is different. This is the story of a woman named Dorothy Eady, who later became known as Om Seti. And her life story and the things she claimed to remember from a past life led to real, verifiable, modern-day discoveries in Egypt. Things that professional Egyptologists and historians just couldn't explain. For decades, they tried to prove she was a fraud, that she was lying. And they never could. She knew things she just shouldn't have known. Things that make you stop and wonder, what if she was telling the truth? Our story begins in London in 1904. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family. She was an only child, and her parents absolutely adored her. Life was normal, quiet, and happy for the first 3 years. And then, one day, everything changed. Little 3-year-old Dorothy was playing in her home when she took a terrible fall down a flight of stairs. She was knocked completely unconscious. Her parents were frantic. They called for the family doctor, who rushed over to the house. He examined Dorothy, and after a few moments, he had to deliver the worst news imaginable. He turned to her parents and told them their daughter was dead. The next hour was just a blur of grief for her parents. The doctor was there, trying to console them, talking about what needed to happen next. They were in a state of total shock. But then, about an hour after the doctor had pronounced her dead, they heard something, a sound coming from Dorothy's bedroom. They went to check, and they could not believe their eyes. There was Dorothy, sitting up on her bed, playing as if nothing had happened. They rushed in, the doctor right behind them, and they were all just speechless. Dorothy seemed perfectly fine. Her parents, in their confusion and relief, turned on the doctor. They were furious, yelling at him for pronouncing her dead when she was clearly alive. But the doctor was adamant. He swore she had been gone. He had checked for a pulse, for breath. There was nothing. He had no medical explanation for what had just happened. In the days and weeks after the accident, Dorothy's parents noticed some changes. The biggest one was her voice. She started speaking with a strange accent, one they couldn't place at all. They took her to doctors and specialists who suggested she might be suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome. It's a real medical condition that can happen after a significant head injury, and it basically alters a person's speech patterns. To someone who doesn't know, it can sound like they suddenly have a foreign accent. But that wasn't the only strange thing. Dorothy also started talking about a recurring dream. She told her parents that every night she would dream of a huge building with massive pillars. And right next to this building was the most beautiful garden she had ever seen. She would describe the flowers, the trees, the feeling of peace she had when she was there. It was like an oasis. She loved this garden more than anything. But in the dream, she didn't know where it was. And being just 3 or 4 years old, she had a hard time articulating exactly what she was seeing. All she knew was that she loved this place in her dreams, and she talked about it constantly. It got to the point where her mother would often find her crying in her bed, either before going to sleep or right after waking up. When her mother asked what was wrong, Dorothy would say she wanted to go home. Her mother would try to reassure her, saying, "But honey, you are home." And Dorothy would shake her head and insist, "No, I'm not. My home is there, in the garden." She was completely convinced that the place in her dreams was her real home, and nothing her parents said could change her mind. A little while later, when Dorothy was still very young, her parents decided to take her on a trip to the British Museum. The museum had a large exhibit on ancient Egypt. As they walked in, Dorothy spotted the Egyptian section from across the room. Her eyes went wide. She saw the towering statues of pharaohs, the pictures of the pyramids and the Sphinx, and then she just took off. She sprinted away from her parents, running straight into the exhibit. She ran up to the statues, these ancient stone figures, and started kissing their feet. She was sobbing, completely overcome with emotion, and yelling out loud, "I'm home! I'm home! I'm with my people!" This tiny little girl was having this huge emotional revelation right there in the middle of the museum. Her parents were mortified. People were staring, wondering what on earth was wrong with their child. They eventually managed to calm her down and get her to leave, but something had clicked into place for Dorothy. From that day forward, she knew. The beautiful garden from her dreams, the place she longed for, was in Egypt. Her newfound obsession with ancient Egypt started to cause problems. Her family was very devoutly Catholic, and they sent her to Sunday school. But Dorothy would constantly compare the teachings of Catholicism with what she knew about ancient Egyptian religions. This did not go over well. Eventually, the church told her she couldn't come to Sunday school anymore. Then, she was expelled from her Catholic school. The reason was that she refused to sing certain hymns, specifically ones that she felt were disrespectful to the ancient Egyptians. She was even barred from attending Sunday Mass. By the age of 6, Dorothy, who was already a good reader and writer in English, became fascinated with Egyptian hieroglyphics. The moment she saw them, she said they felt familiar, but it was like a language she had forgotten how to read. When she was 7 years old, she was looking through a book one day when she saw a picture. It was a photograph of the Temple of Seti I, which is in a place called Abydos, Egypt. The picture showed the Grand Temple, and next to it were the crumbling remains of what looked like it might have once been a garden. As soon as Dorothy saw it, she pointed and said, "That's it. That's my home." She was absolutely certain. That temple in Abydos was where she was from. She looked closer at the picture, at the broken, tattered remains next to the temple walls. "That's the garden," she said. "But where are all the trees? Why does it look like this?" She couldn't understand that thousands of years had passed. In her mind, she was seeing her home, but it was ruined. The textbook also had a picture of the pharaoh the temple was named after, Seti I. When she saw the image of his very well-preserved mummy, she was once again overcome with emotion. She said she had known him. She remembered him personally. This incredible knowledge didn't go unnoticed. At age 10, she caught the attention of a world-renowned Egyptologist named E.A. Wallace Budge. He was so impressed by her passion and her strange familiarity with the subject that he offered to personally teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics. She picked it up almost instantly, as if she were just remembering something she already knew. As she got older, the dreams continued. But starting around age 14, a new one began. It was a nightmare. In this nightmare, she was trapped in a dark underground room. A high priest was there, interrogating her, demanding she answer his questions. When she refused, he had her beaten. This dream would haunt her for years. Fast forward to when Dorothy, now called Edie, was 27. She met an Egyptian man, and they fell in love. But it's also very likely she saw the marriage as a way to finally get to Egypt. She wanted to secure Egyptian residency. As soon as they were married, they moved. The moment their boat landed in Egypt, Edie was overwhelmed. She got down on her hands and knees, kissed the ground, and cried, saying over and over again, "I'm home. I'm finally home." She and her husband soon had a son, and in a move that surprised no one who knew her, they named him Seti. Once she was living in Egypt, Edie's experiences became even more intense. She claimed she started receiving nightly visits from a spiritual entity she called Hora. She believed Hora was the spirit of the pharaoh, Seti I. For about a year, these visits would happen almost every night. Her husband would wake up in the middle of the night to find her in a trance-like state. She would be sitting up, her eyes glazed over, frantically writing in a notebook, but she wasn't writing in English. She was writing page after page of perfect, intricate hieroglyphics. Her husband said he couldn't snap her out of it. It was like she was possessed, just writing and writing. Edie later explained that Hora was dictating her life story to her, the story of who she used to be. Over the course of that year, she filled over 70 pages with this story, all written in hieroglyphics. And the story went like this. Before she was Dorothy Edie, she was an Egyptian woman named Bentrashite, which means harp of joy. She had lived 3,000 years earlier during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I. Her father was a soldier, and her mother was a simple vegetable seller. Her mother died when Bentrashite was only 3 years old. Her father, unable to care for her on his own, placed her in the temple at Qom el-Sultan, which was near Abydos. She was raised in the temple and eventually became a priestess. When she turned 12, she was given a choice. She could either leave the temple and go out into the world on her own, or she could stay and become a consecrated virgin, dedicating her life to the gods. Bentrashit chose to stay and took the vows. But a few years later, she met Pharaoh Seti I. They fell in love and began a secret relationship. Soon after, she discovered she was pregnant. For a consecrated virgin priestess, this was a catastrophic transgression. The high priest of the temple found out and interrogated her fiercely, demanding to know the name of the father. This interrogation, she realized, was the scene from her recurring nightmare. He had her beaten when she refused to name Seti. Bentrashit knew that if the truth came out, it would cause a massive public scandal for the pharaoh, the man she loved. Unwilling to let that happen, she took her own life. This entire experience, the nightly trances, the obsessive writing of hieroglyphics, the bizarre story of a past life, was all too much for Edie's husband. He grew more and more disturbed by her behavior. In 1936, he filed for divorce. After the divorce, Dorothy and her young son Seti moved to a town near the Giza pyramids. It was around this time that she stopped going by Dorothy Edie. She adopted a new name, Seti, which in Arabic means Mother of Seti. She was fully embracing her new identity, one that was deeply connected to ancient Egypt. She soon took a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, beginning a long and surprisingly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti dedicated her life to her work. She researched and wrote and drew, becoming an expert. Her primary focus, of course, was the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. She learned everything there was to know about its history, its architecture, and the people who lived and worked there 3,000 years ago. It was, after all, the place she believed had been her home. But incredibly, for all those years, she never actually went there. It wasn't until 1952, when she was almost 50 years old, that she finally got the chance to set foot in Abydos. A job transfer came up, and she jumped at the opportunity. In fact, she was so desperate to go that she even took a significant pay cut to get the position. The moment she walked into the temple grounds, she felt a profound sense of familiarity. The first thing she said was, "It's as if I've lived here before." She quickly set up an office for herself in one of the temple's rooms and spent nearly all of her time there, working and just being in the space. She even developed a strange friendship with a wild cobra that lived on the grounds. She would feed it every day, and the snake would just hang out with her. Nobody could make sense of it. Rumors flew around about this eccentric Englishwoman, but her contributions to Egyptology were so significant and so valuable that she earned the deep respect of her colleagues, even if they thought her personal beliefs were strange. But of all her accomplishments, Seti is most famous for what happened shortly after she arrived at the temple. She had been dreaming of that beautiful garden her entire life. She walked around the crumbling exterior of the temple, and then she pointed to a specific spot. She told the chief inspector of antiquities that if they dug right there, they would find the temple garden. The archaeologists were skeptical. There were no records, no texts, nothing to suggest a garden had ever been in that location. But Seti was so certain. She didn't just point to the spot, she described the entire layout. She told them where the pathways would be, what kinds of trees they would find, and where those trees were planted. To appease her, and probably to prove her wrong, they decided to dig. And they were stunned. They dug down, and there it was. A garden. Exactly where she said it would be. And as they excavated, they found that the layout, the root systems of the ancient trees, everything matched her descriptions perfectly. This was information she could not have possibly known. It wasn't written down anywhere. But that was just the beginning. She then told them to excavate on the north side of the temple. She said there was a secret, undiscovered tunnel that ran underneath the temple from that side. Again, the archaeologists were doubtful. But again, they dug. And sure enough, there was the tunnel. It was a major discovery, and only she knew about it. Her uncanny knowledge didn't stop at the temple. She also pointed researchers to a specific unexplored area in the Valley of the Kings, a famous burial ground for pharaohs. She told them they would find a long-forgotten tomb there. They searched where she indicated, and they found a tomb that had never been discovered before. Time and time again, she provided information that led to incredible finds. The other Egyptologists, the scientists and academics, they didn't want to believe her story about reincarnation. They wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a strange woman, maybe an elaborate and clever hoax. But they were faced with a problem they couldn't solve. They couldn't deny the results. She possessed an intimate, detailed knowledge of the Temple of Seti I and the surrounding area during the exact time frame she claimed to have lived there as Bentreshit. They simply could not explain how she knew what she knew. Right before she passed away at the age of 81, Seti shared one final secret. She said that deep beneath the Temple of Seti I, there is a secret chamber. And inside that chamber, there is another secret, a library of records or a hidden tomb, something of incredible importance. But she passed away before she could give more specific directions. No one knows exactly where to begin looking. And so, without Seti to guide them, her final secret may be one that is lost to time. Her story leaves us with so many questions. Without any logical, rational explanation for her knowledge, for her ability to pinpoint lost gardens and secret tunnels, even skeptics are left to wonder. Was she a brilliant hoaxer who somehow found lost information that no one else could? Or was Dorothy Eady, the little girl from London, truly the reincarnation of a priestess from ancient Egypt? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.